Dust settled over the auction block where human lives were bartered for silver. Jeremiah Caldwell, a scarred trapper who hadn't spoken to a soul in 5 years, only came to town for winter supplies. He never intended to leave with a desperate widow and her 4 trembling children. The biting wind of November 1876 whipped through the muddy thoroughfare of Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory. It was a town born of desperation and sustained by greed, a place where the fallout from the panic of 1873 still choked the life out of honest folk. In the center of the town square stood a hastily erected wooden platform. It wasn't cattle or timber being sold today, but human labor. Under the brutal territorial debtor laws, a family could be auctioned off into indentured servitude if the patriarch died, leaving unpayable debts. That was the tragic fate of Abigail Mercer. Abigail stood on the rough-hewn planks, her posture rigid, with a terrifying mix of pride and sheer panic. At 32, her face was lined with the exhaustion of a frontier life, yet her eyes retained a fierce, protective fire. Clinging to her faded woolen skirts were her 4 children, 14-year-old Levi, whose fists were clenched in helpless rage, 10-year-old Hannah silently weeping, and the 5-year-old twins, Samuel and Ruth, too young to understand why the townspeople were staring at them like prized livestock. Their debt was owed to Thaddeus Montgomery, a ruthless land baron whose influence stretched all the way to the federal courts, whispering in the ears of magistrates as far down as Judge Isaac Parker's jurisdiction. Montgomery didn't just want his money, he wanted to break the Mercer family. "Do I hear $50 for the boy?" the auctioneer bellowed, spit flying from his lips. "Strong back. Good for the silver mines." "No, you can't separate us," Abigail screamed, lunging forward only to be shoved back by a deputy's rifle barrel. "75 for the mother," Montgomery drawled from the front row, tipping his black Stetson. He took a drag from a thin cigar, his eyes roaming over Abigail with a sickening sense of ownership. "She'll do well scrubbing the floors of my saloon. Send the little ones to the territorial orphanage. They're dead weight." A horrified murmur rippled through the crowd, but no one dared bid against Montgomery. To cross the barren was to invite a mysterious fire at your homestead, or a fatal accident on a lonely trail. Standing at the very back of the crowd, shrouded in a heavy grizzly bear coat, was Jeremiah Caldwell. Jeremiah was a mountain man, a ghost who haunted the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range. Standing 6'4" with a thick, untamed beard and a jagged scar tearing across his left cheek, a souvenir from a territorial dispute with a mountain lion, he was a figure of local folklore. He only came down from the high country twice a year to trade his thick furs and Black Hills gold dust for coffee flour and ammunition. He despised Bitter Creek. He despised the noise, the greed, and the cruelty of civilized men. He had turned to leave his supply wagon fully loaded when the sound of little Ruth's crying pierced the cold air. Jeremiah froze. The sound was a ghost from his own past, a chilling echo of a life he had buried beneath 6 feet of frozen mountain soil 8 years ago. He closed his eyes, the memory of his own daughter's final, feverish cries, threatening to shatter the walls of ice he had built around his heart. He opened his eyes. Montgomery was stepping up to the platform, reaching out to grab Levi by the collar to inspect his teeth. Something inside the mountain man snapped. $500. The gruff, gravelly voice cut through the town square like a thunderclap. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide path between the auction block and the hulking figure in the bear coat. Montgomery spun around his face, flushing dark purple. "Who the hell do you think you are, mountain trash? The debt is $300. You can't outbid the debt holder without settling the sum in full in cash." Jeremiah didn't speak. He walked forward with slow, deliberate steps, his boots squelching in the freezing mud. The townspeople shrank back from him, intimidated by the sheer imposing mass of the man and the cold, dead look in his steel-grey eyes. He reached the auctioneer's table, unhooked a heavy oilskin pouch from his leather belt, and slammed it down with a force that rattled the wood. "Weigh it," Jeremiah growled. The auctioneer, trembling, untied the pouch. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. It was filled with raw, unminted gold nuggets and thick, heavy dust, the pure, untainted bounty of the high creeks. "This is easily worth $800. The auctioneer stammered, looking terrified. "Settle the debt," Jeremiah commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a lethal edge. "The family stays together. They come with me." Montgomery stepped off the platform, his hand hovering dangerously close to the silver-handled revolver at his hip. "You're making a grave mistake, Caldwell. Ezekiel Mercer owed me more than just coin. You don't know what you're buying into." Jeremiah finally turned his gaze to the land baron. The mountain man didn't reach for the heavy Sharps rifle slung across his back, nor the hunting knife at his thigh. He simply stared Montgomery down with the unflinching intensity of an apex predator. "The debt is paid," Jeremiah said. "Step aside, Thaddeus, before I decide to buy your life too." For a long, agonizing moment, the town square was completely silent. Then Montgomery scoffed, spitting into the mud. "Keep the trash, but you'll find they carry more trouble than they're worth." He turned and stalked away, his lackeys trailing behind him like whipped dogs. Jeremiah looked up at the platform. Abigail was clutching her children, staring down at him with wide, terrified eyes. She had been saved from Montgomery, but looking at the scarred, massive wild man who had just purchased her family's freedom, she wasn't sure if she had been rescued or condemned to a much darker fate. "Get your things," Jeremiah told her gruffly, turning his back to walk toward his wagon. "We ride before the snow hits." The journey up into the Wind River Range was a grueling test of endurance. The Mercer family sat huddled in the back of Jeremiah's heavy freight wagon, wrapped in every woolen blanket they owned, plus the thick Hudson's Bay blankets Jeremiah had silently tossed to them before departing. For 2 days they climbed higher into the unforgiving wilderness. The pines grew thicker, the air thinner, and the temperature plummeted. Through it all, Jeremiah barely spoke. He drove the massive draft horses with subtle clicks of his tongue and minor shifts of the leather reins. When they stopped to make camp, he functioned with terrifying mechanical efficiency. He chopped wood, sparked a fire in minutes, and handed Abigail a cast-iron skillet of sizzling salt pork and hardtack, never meeting her gaze. Abigail's mind raced with terrifying scenarios. Why did he buy us? She agonized silently as she watched him clean his rifle by the firelight. Does he want a servant? A wife, slaves to work a hidden mine? On the evening of the second day, little Samuel, shivering despite the fire, began to cough violently. Abigail held him close, her heart pounding with the familiar dread of frontier pneumonia. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell over them. Abigail flinched, pulling her children back. Jeremiah stood over them, holding a heavy, beautifully preserved buffalo robe. Without a word, he knelt his huge frame, looking awkwardly gentle, and draped the massive pelt over the sleeping twins, tucking the edges under their boots to seal out the wind. He then handed Abigail a tin cup of boiling water, steeped with pine needles, and a strange, bitter-smelling root. "Osha root," he muttered, his voice rusty from disuse. "Clears the lungs. Make him drink." He walked back to his side of the fire before she could even whisper a thank you. Levi, the oldest, watched the mountain man with narrowed, distrustful eyes. "Don't trust him, Ma," Levi whispered, his hand resting on the small hunting knife his late father had given him. "He's just fattening us up for winter." "Hush, Levi," Abigail murmured, forcing the warm tea past Samuel's lips. "We are alive. For now that is enough." On the third afternoon, the wagon finally crested a steep ridge, revealing a hidden valley surrounded by towering snow-capped peaks. In the center of the clearing, nestled against a clear, rushing creek, sat a massive, sturdily built log cabin. It was a fortress of rough-hewn pine with a slate roof and a stone chimney puffing welcoming white smoke into the gray sky. Jeremiah halted the horses. "End of the line," he announced. Inside the cabin was a stark contradiction. It was unmistakably a bachelor's den smelling of wood smoke, gun oil, and dried tobacco, but it was immaculately clean. Traps hung neatly on the walls alongside dried herbs and massive elk antlers. "Take the main bed," Jeremiah told Abigail, gesturing to a large frame covered in furs in the corner. "Kids can take the loft. I sleep by the hearth. Mr. Caldwell." Abigail finally spoke up, her voice trembling but resolute. "I must know. What do you expect of us? I will work. I will cook and mend, and my boy Levi is a hard worker, but I need to know the terms of our arrangement." Jeremiah stopped, unbuckling his gun belt. He turned slowly, his scarred face unreadable in the dim light. "You expect to be treated like property. You bought our debt. Under the law, we belong to you. The law in Bitter Creek is written by thieves." Jeremiah growled softly. He looked at the 4 children huddled together. A flash of deep, agonizing pain crossed his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. "There are no terms, Mrs. Mercer. You're here because Montgomery is a rat, and I don't let rats drown children. Keep the cabin tidy if you want. Cook if you want. But you belong to no one." He grabbed his axe and walked out the heavy oak door, leaving Abigail stunned in the center of the room. Over the next 2 weeks, a strange, fragile routine settled over the cabin. Jeremiah spent his days hunting or checking his trap lines, returning at dusk with fresh meat. He remained a man of few words, but Abigail began to notice the subtle things. When he chopped wood, he always made sure there was a stack of kindling small enough for Levi to carry easily. When he carved wood by the fire at night, he deliberately left the curled shavings on the floor for the twins to play with. But the mystery of Jeremiah Caldwell truly unraveled on a Tuesday afternoon when Abigail decided to deep clean the darkest corners of the cabin. In the back of the small storage pantry, hidden beneath a heavy canvas tarp, she found an intricately carved wooden cradle. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, detailed with running horses and soaring eagles. Inside the cradle lay a small, beautifully stitched baby blanket, folded with desperate, heartbroken care. Beside it sat a leather-bound journal. Abigail knew she shouldn't look, but her maternal instinct drove her hand. She opened the cover. The handwriting was elegant, belonging to a woman. April 14th, 1868. Jeremiah has finished the cradle. He is so proud, though he won't admit it. He sits for hours just touching the wood, whispering to my belly. He is the fiercest man I have ever known, yet with us. His hands are made of feathers. I pray this winter fever breaks soon. I feel so weak, but Jeremiah's strength keeps me anchored to this world. The entries stopped abruptly, 3 pages later. Abigail felt the breath leave her lungs. She walked softly to the back window of the cabin, wiping away the frost. Through the glass, she looked out toward the edge of the tree line. There, half buried in the fresh snow, was a small wrought-iron fence enclosing 2 modest stone markers. Jeremiah wasn't a monster. He was a man who had been bled dry by grief, a father who had his heart violently ripped away by the harsh frontier. She turned back to the room, wiping a tear from her cheek, only to find Levi standing in the doorway, his face pale and stricken. But he wasn't looking at the cradle. He was holding his father's old leather-bound Bible, the one Ezekiel Mercer had made Levi swear to protect with his life. The lining of the Bible's back cover had torn open. "Ma!" Levi whispered, his voice cracking. He held up a thick folded piece of parchment that had been hidden inside the leather. "I found this in Pa's book. It has Montgomery's name on it." Abigail took the parchment. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon, her blood turning to ice. It wasn't a debt ledger. It was a federal land deed, registered to Ezekiel Mercer for a subterranean silver vein located directly underneath Montgomery's newly built town bank. Montgomery didn't legally own the land his fortune was built upon. Ezekiel did, and by extension, Abigail and the children did. "Dear God," Abigail breathed. "This is why he wouldn't let us leave. This is why he wanted us indentured or dead." A sudden sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the valley, shattering the quiet afternoon. Abigail screamed, throwing her arms around Levi and pulling him to the floor, just as the cabin's front window exploded inward. Shards of glass showered over the wooden floorboards. Down in Bitter Creek, Thaddeus Montgomery hadn't just let his prize walk away. He had learned that the deed was missing from the Mercer estate. He had hired 6 heavily armed Pinkerton dropouts and ruthless bounty hunters, tracking the heavy wagon ruts up the mountain before the snow could cover them. Outside in the biting cold, Jeremiah Caldwell dropped behind a massive fallen pine, his Sharps rifle smoking in his hands. He had spotted the men creeping up the ridge just in time. He looked back at the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't in 8 long years. He had sworn he would never let another family die on his mountain. He cocked the hammer of his rifle, his steel-grey eyes narrowing as the bounty hunters began to close in on his home. The lonely mountain man was about to show them exactly why the locals called him the ghost of the Wind River Range. The heavy boom of Jeremiah's Sharps rifle echoed through the canyon like a cannon blast, instantly followed by the frantic screams of a man taking a slug to the thigh. Outside the cabin, the pristine white snow was rapidly becoming a battlefield. Inside, Abigail scrambled across the floorboards, her hands blooded from the shattered glass, and threw herself over Samuel and Ruth. "Stay down. Do not move. Do you hear me?" she commanded, her voice trembling but fierce. She shoved them under the heavy oak dining table, pulling Hannah down beside them. Levi didn't hide. The 14-year-old boy crawled toward the shattered window, his father's hunting knife clenched in one hand, and an old rusted Colt revolver he had found in the wagon in the other. "Levi, no!" Abigail shrieked. "I have to help him, Ma!" Levi yelled back, peering over the splintered windowsill. "There's too many of them." Out in the timber, Jeremiah Caldwell was a phantom. The 6 bounty hunters Thaddeus Montgomery had sent were accustomed to gunning down terrified debtors in dark alleyways, not hunting a seasoned mountain man in his own territory. Jeremiah slid behind the massive trunk of a fallen ponderosa pine, rapidly reloading the single-shot rifle. His breath plumed in the freezing air, his mind calculating angles and distances with cold, practiced precision. "Spread out!" roared a voice from the tree line. It was Cyrus Hoyt Montgomery's chief enforcer, a vicious man, recognizable by the bowler hat he wore even in the wilderness. "He's just one man, flush him out." 2 men broke from the cover of the spruce trees, their Winchester repeaters blazing, sending a hail of lead chewing into the logs of Jeremiah's cabin. Jeremiah didn't flinch. He waited for the slight pause in their firing, the inevitable moment they levered fresh rounds into their chambers. He popped up, leveled the heavy barrel of the Sharps, and fired. The chest-caving impact sent the closest man tumbling backward into a snowdrift, his rifle flying from his hands. Jeremiah didn't wait to see him land. He dropped the long gun, drew his twin Remington revolvers, and dove into a shallow trench he had dug weeks ago for drainage. Bullets shredded the pine needles exactly where he had been standing a second before. He scrambled up the icy embankment, using the thick brush to mask his movements, flanking the men who thought they had him pinned. He moved with the silent, terrifying grace of the grizzly whose fur he wore. Emerging beside a boulder just 10 yards from 2 of the attackers, he unleashed a volley of deafening revolver fire. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs and cursed shouts. 3 down, 3 to go. But the distraction had cost him. While Jeremiah was dealing with the flank, Cyrus Hoyt and another heavily armed thug had used the diversion to rush the cabin. Inside, Levi saw them coming. His hand shook wildly as he aimed the heavy Colt over the windowsill. "Stay away!" the boy screamed, pulling the trigger. The gun bucked violently, the bullet shattering the wooden porch post inches from Hoyt's head. Hoyt snarled, bringing his rifle up to aim directly at the young boy in the window. "Stupid little rat!" "Levi!" Abigail screamed, lunging to pull her son down. A thunderous roar tore through the clearing. Jeremiah had broken cover, sprinting across the open snow toward his cabin. He fired his remaining revolver on the run, dropping the man next to Hoyt, but he was exposed. Hoyt pivoted, his lips curling into a wicked sneer, and fired his Winchester. The bullet caught Jeremiah high in the left shoulder. The sheer kinetic force spun the massive mountain man around, dropping him to his knees in the blood-stained snow. The Remington slipped from his grasp. "Jeremiah!" Abigail cried out the name, tearing from her throat before she even realized she had spoken it. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. Hoyt chuckled slowly, walking toward the kneeling mountain man, racking another round into the chamber of his rifle. "Montgomery sends his regards, you wild animal. Should have minded your own business." He raised the barrel to Jeremiah's head. Crack! Hoyt's eyes went wide. He gasped, dropping his rifle, as a blooming red patch appeared on his heavy winter coat. He looked down, confused, then slowly tipped forward, collapsing face first into the mud and snow. Behind him, standing on the cabin porch, was Abigail. Her hands were still wrapped around the smoking barrel of Jeremiah's spare shotgun, which she had found loaded by the front door. Her chest heaved, her eyes wide with shock, but she didn't drop the weapon. The clearing fell dead silent, save for the howling of the mountain wind. The remaining bounty hunter, seeing his 5 companions dead or bleeding out, threw his hands in the air, dropped his guns, and scrambled blindly into the woods, fleeing for his life. Jeremiah remained on his knees, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked up at Abigail standing on the porch, the shotgun trembling in her hands, her hair whipped into a frenzy by the wind. She wasn't a broken debtor anymore. She was a mother who had just defended her family and him. For the first time in 8 years, the ice around the mountain man's heart completely shattered. Smoke and the sharp scent of carbolic soap filled the dim cabin. Jeremiah sat rigidly on a wooden stool by the roaring hearth, his massive, scarred torso glistening with sweat. He clamped his jaw, the muscles jumping wildly, as Abigail probed his torn shoulder with boiled steel forceps. "Almost got it," she murmured, her hands miraculously steady, despite the lingering terror of the gunfight. With a sickening twist, she pulled the twisted chunk of lead free, dropping it into a tin basin. Jeremiah let out a ragged, shuddering breath. As Abigail gently bound the wound with fresh linen, her fingers traced the edge of a deep, older scar on his back. "I found the cradle," she confessed softly, her hands resting warm against his skin. "I am so sorry, Jeremiah." Jeremiah went perfectly still, staring into the dancing flames. "Martha," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry timber. "And my little girl Sarah, the winter fever of 68. I dug their graves through 4 feet of mountain ice. I swore I'd never let myself care for another soul. The mountain takes everything. Abigail stepped around the stool, kneeling to force his evasive grey eyes to meet hers. The mountain didn't bring us here. You did. You bought our lives, and today we fought for yours. Reaching into her apron, she produced the folded, blood-smudged parchment Levi had discovered in the family Bible. She placed it into his massive, calloused hands. And now we fight for our future. Jeremiah unfolded the document with his good arm. His eyes widened as he recognized the federal seal and geographical coordinates. This is a federal mining claim, directly under Bitter Creek. Montgomery doesn't own the town. Abigail stated, her voice hardening with newfound strength. My late husband did. Montgomery wanted us enslaved or dead, so the deed would default to the territory. He wanted to steal our legacy. A dangerous fire ignited in Jeremiah's eyes. Montgomery bought the local judges, but this is a federal grant signed by Washington. We don't run Abigail. I know a man, a U.S. Marshal out of Cheyenne, named Frank Canton. He is a hard, strictly federal lawman who hates Thaddeus Montgomery more than the devil himself. If we get this to him, Canton will ride down on Bitter Creek with the United States Cavalry. 2 days later, under the cover of a moonless night, Levi mounted Jeremiah's fastest horse. He carried the oilskin-wrapped deed and a sworn affidavit. Bypassing Bitter Creek entirely, the 14-year-old rode 30 miles east to a remote railroad telegraph station, wiring the message directly to Marshal Canton's private office. The frontier justice was swift and absolute. 3 weeks later, the spring thaw was melting the mountain snow when a traveling trapper brought the news. Marshal Frank Canton had stormed Bitter Creek with 10 federal deputies. They raided the saloon, seized the ledgers, and when Montgomery reached for his silver-handled revolver, Canton shot it straight out of his hand. Montgomery was now in federal irons, bound for a penitentiary in Leavenworth. Bitter Creek and its vast subterranean wealth legally belonged to the Mercer Trust. Abigail was suddenly one of the wealthiest women in the Wyoming Territory. That evening, the air carried the warm promise of spring. Jeremiah stood on the porch, his heavy saddlebags slung over his good shoulder. His horse was saddled and ready. Abigail stepped out, her heart plummeting. You're leaving. Jeremiah wouldn't look at her. You don't need a mountain man anymore. You have a fortune. You can go back east, buy a mansion in Boston, send the kids to fine schools. He finally turned, his eyes filled with agonizing resignation. My job is done. Your debt is paid. He tipped his hat and stepped toward his horse. Jeremiah Caldwell put those reins down. The sheer command in her voice stopped him cold. Abigail marched down the steps, her eyes flashing. Do you think I care about Boston? Do you think I want my children raised by city folk who turn a blind eye to widows on auction blocks? We owe our lives to this mountain. We owe our lives to you. Abigail, I am not a piece of property you can just set free, she interrupted softly, stepping into his space and pressing her hands against his chest. I am a woman asking the man she loves to stay. Do not make us live without you. Jeremiah stared down at her, the last remnants of his haunted past dissolving in the fierce light of her eyes. Carefully, his massive hands framed her face. He leaned down and kissed her a kiss of desperate healing and an unbreakable promise. When they parted, a rare smile broke across his scarred face. I reckon I better unpack. This cabin needs an extension. If you loved this story of redemption, survival, and unexpected romance in the unforgiving Wild West, hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves a great Western tale. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next thrilling adventure. What do you think you would have done in Jeremiah's boots? Let us know in the comments below.